Hello, and welcome to Enchantment of Eternity's review for Star Trek Lower Decks. Season 2, Episode 3 will always have Tom Paris. This video is a part of a series of videos where I review episodes of Star Trek Lower Decks. In this in this video, I will review the latest episode of Lower Decks. So I'll have to start with a spoiler warning for this episode. If you have not seen it, you will not want to watch this video, otherwise some things will be spoiled for you. So, first of all, I do need to apologize for being late with this review because I was not feeling well this weekend, and that is also why I may sound a bit funny or lacking of energy in this review, and it may not be as long as they tend to be because I am not feeling that well still. But I wanted to get this review out this weekend. So, this episode I think is my least favorite of the season thus far. It's hard to say. I kind of see it as a step backwards into the poor quality that was in season 1. Not that season 1 all had poor quality. There was some really good quality towards the end of season 1. But there were some episodes, particularly towards the start and the middle, that I didn't really care for that much, and this reminded me more of those than the good quality episode we got last week. Last week's episode I thought was hilarious, I thought it was great, I thought the show was moving forward, and this seems like a bit of a halt to me. Now, in this episode we get 3 storylines, basically. We get a storyline with Mariner and Tendi going off on an adventure. We get a storyline with Boimler trying to get his plate signed by Tom Paris. And we get a storyline with Rutherford trying to answer a question. Now, the storyline with Tendi and Mariner was definitely my favorite of the episode. I definitely think it was highlight of the episode. So I'm not saying that this was a terrible episode altogether, because there were definitely aspects and jokes in the storyline that I appreciated. But that being said, I didn't think this was like an amazing storyline that blew me away, but I thought it was one that was good, and then one that ultimately worked. The Boimler storyline I had a lot of issues with. It kind of bugged me and annoyed me, and I didn't think it was that funny. And the Rutherford storyline really pissed me the fuck off. Now, so let me start with the positive. Let me start with the Tendi and Mariner storyline. And the obvious thing to say about this is that they were obviously making the meta jokes about how Rutherford and Tendi always go off on their own separate adventure, and how they never really mix things up. Which is a complaint that I myself have had on this channel a lot during my reviews, and I'm not alone, obviously. A lot of other people have noticed this and have complained about it and found the Tendi and Rutherford storylines not that interesting, and I've been one of them, and every time they put them together, it's I kind of glaze over and gloss over it, and I'm not as interested. That being said, some people do appreciate them, at least some of their storylines. I know a lot of people love that Badgie storyline in season 1, but I hated that. So I tend to not like their storylines at all. And it's not that I don't like the characters of Tendi and Rutherford, because I do. I'm just sick of them always like pairing them up together, and I think that the show works better if they mix it up, as they mentioned in this episode. And I think it was very interesting getting the pairing of Mariner and Tendi together, a pairing that we hardly ever get. And I did find this pairing really interesting and unique, and it brought an interesting perspective to the show. However, I will say I think they did harp on the fact that, because the whole storyline became about how these two people didn't really know each other, and that was a bit less interesting to me, because we already made the meta joke at the start that they never team up, and then they're going to shake things up, but then have to hyper focus on how these two people don't really know each other. I don't know. To me, that seems like, alright, it was kind of harping on the point too much that I would rather that the storyline been about something else. With that being said, I still liked it. I still found it really interesting and, more to the point, funny. I think these two characters had really great chemistry together. There's a couple of things I noticed. First of all, when they playing Domjot with the Nausicaans, they were in fact at Starbase Earhart, which, being the big Star Trek geek that I am, I recognize as that was in fact the starbase that Captain Picard was posted at, or when he was Ensign Picard, when he got attacked by Nausicaans and playing Don Job with them in the episode Tapestry. So that was a nice little Easter egg callback thing, and of course them actually playing Dom Jot with the Tendi and Rutherford. It was funny. Like, they had, as I said, they had great chemistry, and how Tendi just was gonna play the Dom Jot, and she just got pushed when Mariner was fending off the Nausicaan who tried to attack him with a knife, and she ended up winning, and she didn't really care about the fact that she's being attacked, and she was just like, oh, I won! Which I liked that. I thought that was interesting chemistry, and also when Mariner is like, oh, we're tough, our Starfleet's gonna tough, and she was building themselves up to beat up the Nausicaans, and she just like threw Latinum in their face and ran away. A couple other Easter eggs too. This when they first arrived at Quaylar 2, we saw a sign for quarks, which had been established in the episode Picard. We also saw a sign for quarks, so it's kind of establishing that he has set up franchises across the galaxy, which does make a lot of sense that he would prosper in such a way. After all, his brother is Grant Nagus. And so that was a nice little Easter egg too. Maybe one of these days we're actually going to go into one of these franchises and actually see Quark, but we'll see. And I like the of course the funniest part of the episode to me, and again this was kind of predictable, but it was hilarious when Tendi and Mariner went to the Orion pirates, and Tendi's plan was for Mariner to go undercover as a pirate, and she just said, talk like a pirate. And so as soon as she said that, I knew Mariner was going to go in there and go, "Arr, matey," which it didn't make it any less funny. It was fucking hilarious, and I love how the Ranger was like, "What?" But I don't know. I kind of didn't like the fact that Tendi had a cousin who was like a pirate, and that she used her pheromones or whatever to control him, because she was saying that there was something that she wasn't. She seemed to be like indicate that not all Orions are like that, and this is kind of feeding into that cultural stereotype, which is something that is not good when Star Trek does, when it says all aliens are exactly like that. And in season 1, they Tendi would get really offended when people would stereotype her like this, but it's not that bad, because she is implying that it's a past that she's trying to get away from, she's ashamed of, and doesn't want anyone to know about, which is, that's all well and good, but for me, it would have been better if she wasn't connected to pirates at all. But anyway, that's just a minor complaint. I did find this whole thing hilarious. Also, I love the whole thing about the Cation scratching post or whatever. I love how they're making fun of like Punk Far, and they even compared it, and like when she was going all crazy and she needed the scratching post, and it was hilarious when Mariner and Tendi were finding out what it was, and they were kind of fucking around with it and be like, "Oh, new scratching post." The fact that they broke it and had to go find a replacement was very sitcom-ish. Very Brady Bunch-esque, dare I say, but but it's a comedy show, so I give it some leeway for that, but it's still kind of a cliche storyline. But I loved the ending where, and I thought it was kind of predictable that Dr. what's her name, Katana or Tana, that she wouldn't care about the actual post. I kind of knew that it was going to happen, that Tendi was worrying about nothing, because that's, again, typical for these sitcom-esque plots. But I did not predict, and I found it absolutely hilarious, that she just wanted the box. And now, being a cat lover and someone who loves cats and have cats, that's something I love making fun of and pointing out the fact that cats just love sitting in boxes, and you can buy them the most expensive cat treat toy, and they kind of neglect it, and they just go straight for the box, the cardboard box that it comes in. And so I thought that joke was hilarious, that she just wanted, and the way she was sitting in the box is the way like a normal house cat would go, of course it doesn't make any sense, because she could just replicate any box if she just wanted the box, but who cares, it was a really funny joke that I really liked. And then, of course, there is the big drop that Mariner gave, that she's basically pansexual, has saying how she is attracted to bad boys, bad girls, bad non-binary individuals, bad binaries, binars. Yeah, that's what they're called. Now that I say that, I want to see Mariner date a couple binars. Anyway. So, yeah, and I've heard a lot of other people, YouTubers and whatnot, talk about this and saying that, yeah, this is all well and good, because it is good for Star Trek to have more LGBTQ representation, because historically that is one thing that's been really lacking incredibly in Star Trek up until very recently with Discovery, and so more Star Trek shows that have more LGBTQ representation is a good thing. However, much like the reveal of Loki being pansexual, they kind of they need to do more than just tell. They need to show, rather than just play lip service and be like, "Oh, I'm pansexual. Let's come on, let's see it. Let's see her in a non-hetero relationship." It kind of reminds me of the show House MD, when they talked about the character 13 first came on the show, played by Olivia Wilde, and they kept always crack jokes about how she was bisexual. She's like, "Oh, you're bi," but they never actually showed her in a same-sex relationship, and so it was kind of playing lip service, but eventually they did. They did show her in several same-sex relationships, so eventually they did put their money where their mouth is, so hopefully it will be the same thing with Lower Decks. And one last thing I'll say about the storyline is the fact that it was brought up that Mariner served on Deep Space Nine, which is a very interesting tidbit. I know we got this flashback with her before, but she was on a ship that was docked at Deep Space Nine. The fact that she had actually served at Deep Space Nine, well, that's news to me. And she mentioned Worf, so we know that she was there during the, I believe, 4 years that Worf was there. So that's really interesting. I would love if they had more flashbacks, maybe a whole episode of her or in Deep Space Nine. I would love that. Maybe that would allow for some cameos from some of the DS9 actors. Hopefully they're setting up for that by mentioning this, and it's not something that will just drop for no reason, but yeah. Anyway, let me get into the next storyline now with Boimler. I like the premise of this at first, where Tom Paris is coming aboard and Boimler is fanboning out, and he had the commemorative plates, which of course is making fun of the Star Trek plates that existed in reality, and how he was collecting them and getting all the crew members of Voyager to sign. I love how he said "voy." He kept saying "voy," and they pointed out, it's like, why are you saying "voy"? It's like, oh, it saves time. And then Mariner started saying "voy." She's like, oh, it does save time. It reminded me a bit of a friend I had who used to make fun of people who did the acronym of DS9 instead of saying D Space 9, because it's the same exact number of syllables, and so it isn't actually any shorter to say. But "voy" is a little bit shorter to say than Voyager, but to say, oh, it saves time, is of course a joke. And of course, it's kind of similar to what they did with Ransom saying TOS, calling the original stage error TOS, and he says, oh, those old scientists, was just like an end joke of the official like abbreviation for the show, and this was very similar to that, so I did appreciate that. What bothered me about the storyline is the fact that the computer didn't recognize Boimler, and I know a lot of people aren't going to be bothered, and I know this is probably just a personal issue, and maybe I can't explain why exactly I was bothered by this, but it just annoyed me. It just seemed very un-Star Trek-like, or very inconsistent with how ships have been portrayed in the past. Now, I know Lower Decks is a comedy show, and it does do things a bit more loose and outrageous for comedic effect, and a lot of times I'm okay with that. Sometimes I'm not, and this is one of them, and I can't really articulate exactly why. It just bothered me from the get-go when he went to the replicator and the computer wouldn't recognize him. The fact they made the entire storyline about that annoyed the hell out of me, because the whole time it was happening, I was just couldn't buy it. It's like a suspension of disbelief that I couldn't achieve. Like, the whole time I was like, no, this is fake. This wouldn't happen. The computer would not act like this. This is not realistic. This is not consistent with Star Trek. Now, I had complaints. I know a lot of people are going to disagree with me on this, and this is fine. But I've had complaints about Star Trek or Lower Decks before, because Lower Decks is a unique show because it has to try to walk the line from being a comedic show that sort of makes fun of Star Trek and points out some of its ridiculous flaws and whatnot, while at the same time being a Star Trek show that actually fits into canon. And a lot of times I think that show does a really good job balancing that very careful balancing act, but every once in a while I think they'll go too much into the preposterous side, and that actually ruins the comedy for me when it's completely inconsistent with Star Trek. Usually I don't actually complain about technology or stuff, but just seemed so unlikely and just so something that would never happen in a billion years, that a computer would fail to recognize. I mean, there's guests who don't serve aboard the ship who come aboard and computer recognize. Like, if they want to get something from the replicator, they'll get something from the fucking replicator. And now, I know the excuse this episode gives is, oh, the security's really buffed up because of the Packlets. During the freaking Dominion War, the security wasn't this tight. And you can't tell me on a secondary ship like the Cerritos and the Packlet is not that big of a threat that their security measures would be greater than a warship during war times. Bullshit. This is, people can go up and order fucking coffee from the replicator. So, and then the fact that the doors wouldn't even open for them, that was preposterous. That was beyond preposterous. I know some people would think I'm being nerdy about this, but you know, if you didn't have an issue with it, you know, like, oh, it's a comedy show, I'll just go with it. That's fine. I'm great. You know, I'm happy for you. That's great for you. But just my personal instinct, like my internal instinct, which I couldn't help, just my natural reaction to this was to reject it, and therefore I did not find it humorous because it was just annoying. It was bothering me. I was like, well, this is just stupid. But that's just my opinion. So I couldn't enjoy this whole storyline because the whole storyline was about Boimler trying to get to the bridge to see Tom Paris, and the ship not recognizing him and putting himself in danger, which I thought was dumb. And then the resolution to it, where he like gets all dirty and gets oxygen deprived and acts a bit insane, and shows up on the bridge all dirty, and Tom Paris says, "Oh, a Kazon," and starts punching him. That is very sitcomish, cliche. Is very stereotypical sitcom reaction, which actually doesn't make sense for the character of Tom Paris that he would react that way. He knows that the Kazon are in the Alpha Quadrant, and it's just a foolish reaction, and that gets me into my bigger complaint about how Tom Paris, they underused him. Like, he was just basically a cameo that showed up, and it was like, people were like, oh, look, it's Tom Paris, don't get us trapped in the Delta Quadrant, and that's all he did. And I'm sorry, but if you're going to call the episode We'll Always Have Tom Paris, which of course is a play on the episode title, We'll Always Have Paris, and he's just a glorified cameo, that bothers me. Like, they could have done more with Tom Paris, integrated him more like they did with Riker and Troy, integrated him more into the comedy, into the ship, made him part of the storyline, but instead he was just a celebrity there for people to gawk at, and it had a very cliche, stereotypical, frankly not funny storyline with Boimler where he's trying to suck up or get someone's autograph and everything goes wrong. It's very by the numbers, very unoriginal, and frankly not funny because it's something I've seen a billion times before. And the whole thing with Tom Paris freaking out and punching him because he thinks it's a Kazon wouldn't beyond cliche and unbelievable. And I thought it was really, really dumb. Now, the one thing, that I did like about the storyline was when he was in the Jeffrey tube and he was running out of oxygen and the plate was talking to him. I did find that funny, especially when the plate was like, whoa, you better be concerned about this oxygen deprived because you are, in fact, talking to a plate. I thought that was hilarious. And I liked the whole thing of the void and getting the plates and all that in the first place, but everything else about the storyline just bothered me, and I don't think it was a good introduction to Boimler back in the show. It's like they were acting all nonchalant about Boimler being back, like he's always been back, and it's a foregone conclusion, which I wanted more sort of interaction with Boimler and the others for his first episode back, but maybe they'll do that in the future. Anyway, let me now get into the Rutherford storyline, which if you think I was harsh on the Boimler storyline, oh boy, wait until you hear what I have to say about Rutherford. So, in regards to the Rutherford storyline, I am first, of course, referring to the fact that Lieutenant Shaxs has returned from the dead and very non-ceremoniously. In fact, everyone, except for Rutherford, is very nonchalant about it. It was like, oh yeah, senior officers come back from the dead all the time, who cares? It's played for laughs, and we have a storyline where Rutherford is like freaking out, trying to figure out how he came back from the dead, and they make a joke about it because when some other random ensign asks him, they're like, "Oh, how dare you? You're, go to your quarters," or whatever. And then eventually Rutherford breaks down and he's like, "I have to know." And so Shaxs tells him, it's like, "But it's a deep, dark secret." And we find that it's really this is just a bunch of nonsense bullshit. And it's deeply disturbing to him. He's like, "No, I wish I never knew." First of all, that's not a funny storyline. And regardless of my feelings, which I'm about to get into on how detrimental I think this is to the show, it's not funny. I didn't find it humorous. And again, this is like what I said with the Boimler, the ship not recognizing. This is like that, but to a much larger degree. That this is completely unbuyable, unbelievable, and it's just... Okay, so I had speculated in earlier videos that perhaps they would bring Shaxs back from the dead. So I'm actually not disappointed or surprised to see Shaxs back. I'm actually very open to the possibility of him coming back to life. In fact, I talked about this in earlier videos. I thought that they could make a very funny Star Trek 3 rift, the search for Shaxs or something, and make a really funny joke out of it. But they needed to handle it correctly if they were going to do it. I'm not opposed to the idea of them doing it. I just think they needed to handle with extreme care, which I don't think this is at all, because even though this is a mostly comedic, lighthearted show, there are some serious dramatic elements to the show, particularly in the finale, in which Shaxs gave his life for Rutherford. And in fact, Rutherford had mentioned it in earlier episodes of Season 2 as being a very significant moment in his life. He lost his memories. And so there is a serious dramatic element to that. A lot of people during the break talked about how impactful Shaxs' death is and how it brought a tear to their eyes and how it was a powerful moment. Now, let me make a comparison. Let me compare this to Spock's death in Star Trek II, The Wrath of Khan. He was brought back to life in Star Trek III, The Search for Spock, but that didn't diminish the power of his death. I can still go back and watch Star Trek II and watch his death scene and still be moved by it, even though I know that he's just going to come back to life soon anyway. Because I actually think that they handled his resurrection well. And then there's another character, I won't get into spoilers, but another character in Game of Thrones who was also resurrected, and I think they handle his resurrection well as well, so it doesn't, I think, diminish the power of the death scene, whereas I think having all the characters be nonchalant about it and be like, oh yeah, the senior staff come back from the dead all the time, is not being respectful, is not handling it well. It's just a big ball of nonsense that's too offensive to be funny and too detrimental to the show to be funny. Because here's the thing. The show is always played on lower deckers don't know what's going on. Like, there was an episode in season 1 that handled this. Well, they had that whole party thing, which I fucking hated, so that was too extreme. But usually, like, they handle it very well with, the lower deckers being kept in the dark. And that's what the Star Trek Next Generation episode Lower Decks also centered on. However, I think sometimes this show goes a bit overboard with it, does it too much, and to a too absurd degree. And I think this is probably the worst example of that. I'm sorry, I don't care what anyone says. People are entitled to their feelings and their opinions on this, of course, but it doesn't matter what anyone else tells me. I will never, ever, in the slightest bit, buy that the senior officers would just have this character come back to life after being dead and not even mention anything to anyone about it and just act like nothing happened. That's bullshit. It's not funny. It's annoying as fuck, and I think it is very disrespectful to the storyline of the season 1 finale. It damages. I think in retrospect, when I go back and watch that Shaxs death in season 1, it's no longer going to move me. It's not going to bring a tear to my eye. I'm just going to think, well, this is just horseshit because they just bring him back unceremoniously and a couple episodes later anyway, so who fucking cares? Which, again, is different than the Spock thing, even though they brought him back in the very next movie, because they were respectful about it. They made it make sense for the story. They made it work. They acknowledged that him coming back to life was a huge deal. That's probably the key. And so having it and playing it for the stupid comedic storyline, which frankly is not funny, about, oh, it's dark, deep secret, it'll disturb your soul, is just a bunch of bullshit that insults my intelligence. It insults my intelligence, and it actively pisses me off that they would do that. Now, and of course, like, the fact that Mariner... Let me make another comparison, because Mariner and Boimler are like, oh yeah, senior officers always coming back from the dead. No, they're fucking not! I tried to look back in Star Trek to think of other examples when people are brought back from the dead. There's, maybe I'm forgetting a few, but I know there's, Spock, obviously. There's Neelix, who was saved, who was dead, declared dead, but then Seven of Nine used nanotechnology to save him. There was Kirk, who died into darkness, but that's the Kelvin timeline, so who gives a fuck about that? And I think there are a few other examples as well, but most of those examples, other than the Spock one, I couldn't think of any. Maybe someone in the comments will correct me, but I couldn't think of anyone other than the Spock one where a significant amount of time had passed between the character's death and the resurrection. Like the Neelix thing, like that was almost immediately. He was declared dead for like a couple hours and then immediately brought back to life. So it wasn't like 2 weeks or however long, or 2 months or however long it's been here. And plus, they made a big fucking deal about the fact that even though he was only dead for 2 hours, they made a whole episode about how disturbing. And by the way, in that episode, they talked about how deep and disturbing it was and how it changed him. But they did it in a very respectful, tasteful way that made sense instead of making it into this stupid joke. Anyway, I think it is very important to distinguish between characters dying and coming back to life and death fake outs, because I think death fake outs are a totally different thing. In fact, when Boimler and Mariner are talking about, oh yeah, all the different ways that people have come back to life, they mentioned the Nexus, but the Nexus didn't come back to life. That was a death fake out. Kirk didn't actually die. he was brought to the Nexus. It's made clear that Shaxs did, in fact, die. There wasn't a death fake out. It was made clear, and in fact, they reinsert that in this episode, that he was, in fact, dead. Now, here's the thing. Lower Deckers, maybe they wouldn't make an announcement and be like, oh, Shaxs brought back to life, but they wouldn't keep it a secret. Like, it would go rumored around the ship. People would know about it. And at the very least, if they didn't want people to know, then they would make up some bullshit excuse to be like, oh, he wasn't actually dead, he was in stasis the whole time, whatever, and they would have a cover story. They wouldn't just pass it off like, oh, no big deal, And again, I know this is played for humor. I don't find it funny. I find it insulting. I find it destructive to the storyline of the previous season. I think it goes a long way of damaging the show's credibility overall. Because as I said, the show has always done a good job, or not always, sometimes it falters, but it usually does a good job of walking the line between credible Star Trek show and comedic Star Trek show. Comedic show that's parodying and making fun of Star Trek. It walks that thin line pretty well most of the time. This completely destroys the line and makes it almost lose all credibility as a serious Star Trek show, and it's going to be hard for me to actually take the show serious anymore and think of this more as a off-the-walls goofball comedy like Rick and Morty, which is this show I don't like as much as most other people because of the fact that I can't take it completely serious, because of the fact that it's so goofball and off the walls, and I just had to take everything with a grain of salt because it doesn't really matter. I mean, there's nothing wrong with shows like that. Like The Simpsons is like that. It's one of my favorite shows of all time. But I knew exactly what kind of off-the-walls crazy show it was. So if they want to commit 100% to that and just fuck being a serious show, then there's a decision and maybe they can make it work. But as far as I understood, and as far as the show is gone, they did want to maintain a level of credibility as a serious drama, and this episode almost completely demolished that credibility. Maybe if they don't do anything this horrible, after a while they start doing good dramatic storylines, then maybe the show will be able to kind of overcome this, and maybe in the future I will go back to being able to take this show seriously. But at the moment, I absolutely cannot, because the way, and I said I was going to make a comparison, but then I went off on a tangent, so let me make this comparison. Let me compare it to last week's episode where Boimler was duplicated. See, that wasn't off-the-walls things, and Mariner and everyone's nonchalant reactions to it was crazy and off the walls, and that's not how people would react to it. They wouldn't go, oh yeah, you're duplicated, pay up, like it's a normal thing, because obviously it's not a normal thing. It's only been known to happen that one time with Riker, and even if it's happened more than once, it's still a weird, obscure, weird thing that people wouldn't expect to happen or wouldn't be so nonchalant about it. But, Lower Decks has done stuff like this before, where they take weird, crazy shit, such as the ransom head in space in the first episode, and treated it with a nonchalant sort of making fun of how Star Trek does crazy shit. And so that I'm okay with, and I'm okay with their reaction to nonchalantly, even though it is absurd, nonchalantly reacting to Boimler being duplicated. And I actually think it adds to the humor, because it is so absurd that they think Boimler being duplicated is but that is more well earned, because they set up for it. They had Boimler said, oh, I'm going to do this transporter trick, the same one they did in the episode Second Chances when Riker got duplicated. So they are setting up for it properly, and they properly explained why this would happen, and that has happened before, and so it made complete sense. And so when they were acting all nonchalant about it or making jokes about it, I was a lot more willing to accept it, because it worked for the show, it made sense, it was set up for properly, and it was funny. Here, they did not properly explain. In fact, they refused to explain why Shaxs come, which was part of the joke, which I think is what makes it so worse. They didn't set up for this properly, and plus, it is taking, as I said, an existing storyline that was relied on serious drama and just shitting all over it and making a joke out of it, which the Boimler duplicating thing was not doing. I mean, granted, you could call the Second Chances thing a serious storyline, but that's in a different show. Boimler being duplicated doesn't diminish any serious dramatic effect of Riker being duplicated in Next Generation. Shaxs nonchalantly coming back to life and nobody gives a fuck about it does completely undercut his serious dramatic death in the first season. So it's a totally different situation. Like, this is taking that, oh, let's act nonchalant to some weird shit, to an absurd extreme that it does not work, it's not believable, and it's not funny. It actively damages the show. And I think that this storyline, it's going to be, I think this episode with that storyline has really damaged my faith in this show. And it's going to be hard for me to take it seriously going forward. They're going to have to re-earn my trust after this episode. And plus, having Shaxs there, it's going to be hard to buy. Every time I see him, it's going to piss me off. So, again, we'll see. We'll see how they handle this. And if they don't come up with a proper explanation for him coming back to life and they just, move on from this, then I will say that finale of season 1 is now a 2 when I gave it an 8 or something. It is now sucks because this show retroactively damaged it. Anyway, yes, that is just how I feel about it. So, my rating for We'll Always Have Tom Paris out of 10, I'm going to give this a 5. Average, and I think that's being incredibly generous. If it wasn't for the Mariner storyline, as much as I liked it, and the jokes and the Tendi coming together and the bar pirate thing, this episode would easily be a 2, possibly even a 1. I mean, I like some of the Boimler jokes, like the talking plate and stuff, and him saying void, that's good too. So I gotta acknowledge that stuff, so it elevates it to a 5. But I can't give this a positive rating. It's just how terrible that Rutherford storyline is and how it has damaged my faith in the show overall. I don't have faith in the heart. Sorry, I know it's been a long road, but going where my heart will take me. But yeah, no, I'll be fair and give this episode a 5. So that's it for my review of We'll Always Have Tom Paris. I shall be back next week and every week to cover Star Trek Lower Decks. So be sure to check me out for that. Also check me out as I cover many other Star Trek shows, as well as covering shows like Star Wars, Clone Wars, Better Call Saul, The Expanse, and more. So be sure to subscribe so you can keep up with all of that. And thanks a lot for watching.